The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of West Texas as Marcus dove behind his patrol car, his heart hammering against his ribs. Another bank had been hit. The third one this month. Morton National Bank this time, and the robbers were getting bolder, more vicious. He could hear their Ford V8 roaring away into the desert, kicking up a tornado of dust that burned his eyes and throat. His partner, Jimmy, was already on the radio, his voice crackling with urgency as he called for backup that Marcus knew wouldn't arrive in time. They never did out here in Cochran County, where the land stretched endless and empty, where criminals could disappear like smoke into the wind. Marcus pressed himself against the hot metal of the car, feeling the sun beat down on his neck like a hammer. The Great Depression had turned good men desperate, and desperate men dangerous. He'd seen it happen over the past 3 years, watching as farms failed, as families packed up and left, as the banks that once seemed invincible began to crumble. And now someone was making sure they crumbled faster, hitting them one by one across the county. Morton, Whiteface, and just last week, Little Bleo, a town so small it barely warranted a dot on the map. But it had a bank, and that bank had money, and money was the only thing that mattered anymore. "They're heading east," Jimmy shouted, lowering the radio, "toward the state line." Marcus knew what that meant. New Mexico. Once they crossed that border, they'd be out of Texas Ranger jurisdiction, at least technically. He'd have to coordinate with local law enforcement, fill out paperwork, wait for approvals. By then, the trail would be cold. He slammed his fist against the car door, the frustration boiling over. How many times had this happened? How many times had they been just minutes too late, just one step behind? "Let's go," Marcus said, yanking open the driver's door. "I'm not letting them get away again." Jimmy hesitated, his young face showing doubt. He was only 23, fresh out of the academy, still believed in doing things by the book. Marcus had been like that once, back before the Depression, back when the world made sense. "Marcus, we should wait for—" "Get in the car, Jimmy." The tone in Marcus's voice left no room for argument. Jimmy climbed in, and Marcus gunned the engine, the tires spinning before catching on the dusty road. The chase was on, but Marcus knew in his gut they wouldn't catch them. Not today. These robbers were too smart, too organized. They had escape routes planned, safe houses established, maybe even people helping them along the way. That's what worried him most. This wasn't just a couple of desperate men with guns. This was organized. This was calculated. As they raced down the empty highway, the desert blurring past them in shades of brown and gold, Marcus's mind wandered to the other cases, the pattern he'd been noticing. Every robbery happened on a Tuesday or Thursday. Every escape route led east, and every tip they'd received, every supposed witness, every supposed sighting, eventually led them to one place. A place Marcus had visited 3 times now, a place that made his skin crawl, even though he couldn't put his finger on why. The Yellow Rose Motel. It sat about 40 miles east of Morton, right on the road to the New Mexico border. A squat, ugly building with peeling yellow paint and a flickering neon sign that buzzed like an angry hornet. Run by an elderly couple, the Hendersons, who seemed harmless enough on the surface. Gerald Henderson was in his 70s, stooped and weathered like an old fence post, with watery blue eyes and hands that shook when he poured coffee. His wife, Mildred, was a bird-like woman who rarely spoke, just watched with dark, unreadable eyes that followed you around the room like a painting in a haunted house. Marcus had questioned them twice already. Once after the Morton robbery, once after Whiteface. Both times they'd been polite but unhelpful. No, they hadn't seen anyone suspicious. No, they didn't keep detailed guest records, just names in a ledger that anyone could fake. No, they didn't remember anyone matching the descriptions of the robbers. They were just an old couple trying to make ends meet, renting rooms for 50 cents a night to travelers passing through. What could they possibly know about bank robberies? But the tips kept coming. Anonymous calls to the ranger station, letters with no return address, whispered conversations overheard in diners and gas stations. The robbers stayed at the Yellow Rose. The robbers were seen near the Yellow Rose. Someone at the Yellow Rose was helping them. The tips were too consistent to ignore, but every time Marcus showed up, there was nothing. No evidence. No suspicious guests, no sign of the robbers at all. "Marcus, they're gone," Jimmy said, breaking into his thoughts. "We lost them." Marcus blinked, realizing the dust cloud ahead had vanished. The robbers had turned off somewhere, maybe onto one of the dozens of dirt roads that crisscrossed the desert, leading to abandoned ranches and forgotten homesteads. He slowed the car, the futility of the chase settling over him like a heavy blanket. "Damn it," he muttered, slamming his hand against the steering wheel. Jimmy looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. "What do we do now?" Marcus stared out at the empty road ahead, the heat shimmering off the asphalt like water. What could they do? File another report that would gather dust in some office? Put out another alert that would be ignored? Wait for the next robbery, the next chase, the next failure? "We go back to the Yellow Rose," Marcus said finally. "Again? Marcus, we've been there. There's nothing." "There's something," Marcus interrupted, his voice hard. "I know there's something. I can feel it." Jimmy sighed but didn't argue. He was learning that when Marcus got that tone, that look in his eyes, it was better to just go along. They turned the car around and headed east, toward the motel that sat like a yellow stain on the horizon. The third visit to the Yellow Rose Motel was different. Marcus could feel it the moment he stepped out of the car. The air seemed heavier somehow, charged with a tension that made the hair on his arms stand up. The neon sign buzzed louder, more insistently. The yellow paint looked more garish in the afternoon sun, almost aggressive in its brightness. And the Hendersons standing in the doorway of the small office looked less like harmless old folks and more like vultures waiting for something to die. "Afternoon, Ranger Coleman," Gerald Henderson called out, his voice raspy. "Back again, I see." Marcus approached slowly, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his gun belt. Not threatening, just ready. "Afternoon, Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Henderson. Just following up on some tips we received." Mildred Henderson's dark eyes fixed on him, unblinking. She hadn't moved from her position in the doorway, hadn't acknowledged his presence with anything more than that stare. It was unnerving the way she looked at people, like she was sizing them up for something. "Tips about what?" Gerald asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Bank robbers. We have reason to believe they might be using your establishment as a stopping point." Gerald shook his head slowly, that same performance Marcus had seen twice before. Ranger, we've been through this. We don't see nobody suspicious here, just regular folks passing through. Mind if I take a look at your guest book again? Gerald hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Marcus caught it. Then the old man shrugged and shuffled into the office, returning with a worn leather ledger. Marcus flipped through the pages, seeing the same kinds of entries as before. John Smith, Robert Jones, Mary Williams, common names that told him nothing. The handwriting varied, suggesting different people, but handwriting could be faked. Dates and times that didn't quite line up with the robberies, but close enough to be suspicious. "This is all you've got?" Marcus asked. "No identification required, no payment records." "Cash business, Ranger," Gerald said, spreading his hands. "Folks pay 50 cents, they get a room for the night. We don't pry into their business." 50 cents. Marcus had heard that number every time he'd visited. It seemed reasonable for a rundown motel in the middle of nowhere. But something about it nagged at him. 50 cents wouldn't keep this place running. The building might be old and ugly, but it had to cost money to maintain. Electricity for that neon sign. Water. Basic upkeep. How did they stay in business on 50-cent rooms when half the time the parking lot was empty? "How many guests do you usually get in a week?" Marcus asked, trying a different angle. Gerald scratched his chin, pretending to think. "Oh, varies. Sometimes 5, sometimes 10. Depends on the week. That's what, $5 a week on average, $20 a month? Sometimes more, sometimes less. That doesn't seem like enough to keep the lights on." Gerald's watery eyes hardened slightly. "We get by, Ranger. Careful with our money. Not everyone needs much to live on." Mildred still hadn't spoken, still hadn't moved. She just stood there in the doorway like a statue, her black dress making her look like a shadow given form. Marcus felt Jimmy shifting uncomfortably beside him. His young partner felt it too, that wrongness that permeated this place. "Mind if we look around?" Marcus asked. "You got a warrant?" There it was. The first time Gerald Henderson had ever pushed back, ever asserted any rights. Marcus studied the old man's face. Seeing something new there. Not fear exactly, but wariness. The wariness of someone with something to hide. "No," Marcus admitted, "but we could get one if necessary." "Then I'd prefer you didn't poke around my property without one," Gerald said, his voice still polite but firmer now. "Nothing personal, Ranger, but a man's got a right to privacy." Marcus knew he was beaten. Without a warrant, without probable cause, he couldn't search the property, and he didn't have enough evidence to get a warrant. Just tips and hunches, and a feeling in his gut that something was wrong. "Fair enough," Marcus said, closing the ledger and handing it back. "But I'll be watching this place, Mr. Henderson. And if I find out you've been lying to me, if I find out you've been helping criminals, you'll be in more trouble than you can imagine." Gerald's expression didn't change. "We're just trying to run an honest business, Ranger. That's all." As Marcus and Jimmy walked back to their car, Marcus glanced back at the motel. Mildred Henderson was still in the doorway, still watching. And for just a moment, Marcus could have sworn he saw her smile. Not a friendly smile. Something else. Something that made his blood run cold. "That place gives me the creeps," Jimmy said once they were back in the car. "Me too," Marcus agreed, starting the engine. "Me too." But as they drove away, Marcus's mind was already working. The Hendersons were hiding something. He was sure of it now. The question was what and how could he prove it? The tips would keep coming, he knew, and the robberies would keep happening. And people would keep dying because he couldn't crack this case, unless he changed his approach, unless he stopped playing by the rules that were clearly getting him nowhere. The thought was dangerous, the kind of thing that could get him fired or worse. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and Marcus Coleman was getting desperate. He needed to get inside that motel, not as a Texas Ranger making an official inquiry, but as someone else, someone the Hendersons might let their guard down around, someone who could see what was really going on behind those peeling yellow walls. The idea formed slowly over the next few days as Marcus sat at his desk in the ranger station, surrounded by case files and witness statements that led nowhere. He couldn't go himself. The Hendersons knew his face, would recognize him immediately. But what if someone else went? Someone undercover? Someone who could pose as a criminal on the run, someone who might be exactly the kind of guest the Hendersons were interested in. The more Marcus thought about it, the more sense it made. If the Hendersons were helping criminals escape, they had to be getting something out of it. More than 50 cents a night, that was for sure. What if they were charging fugitives a premium for safe passage? What if the Yellow Rose was a way station on an underground railroad for criminals, helping them disappear into Mexico where American law couldn't touch them? It would explain everything. The tips about robbers staying there, the convenient location near the border, the Hendersons' evasiveness, the guest book full of fake names. If Marcus could prove it, if he could get evidence of the Hendersons actively aiding fugitives, he could shut the whole operation down, maybe even catch some of the bank robbers in the process. But he needed the right person for the job. Someone tough enough to handle himself if things went wrong, someone smart enough to gather evidence without blowing his cover, someone willing to take the risk. Marcus knew only one man who fit that description. His name was Daniel Crawford, and he was the best undercover operative in the Texas Rangers. Daniel had infiltrated bootlegging operations, gambling rings, and even a nascent drug smuggling operation out of El Paso. He was fearless, clever, and completely committed to the job. If anyone could get inside the Yellow Rose and find out what was really going on, it was Daniel. The meeting was set up quickly. Marcus drove to Austin to brief Daniel in person, not trusting the details to phone lines or telegrams. They met in a small diner on the outskirts of town, sitting in a corner booth where they could talk without being overheard. Daniel Crawford was in his early 30s, with the kind of face that could look either hardened or friendly, depending on what the situation required. He had dark hair, sharp green eyes, and a scar above his left eyebrow from a knife fight in Amarillo that he never talked about. He listened intently as Marcus laid out the situation, occasionally sipping his coffee but never interrupting. "So you want me to pose as a bank robber on the run?" Daniel said when Marcus finished. "That's the idea. Show up at the Yellow Rose, see if the Hendersons take the bait. If they offer to help you escape to Mexico for a price, we've got them. And if they don't, if they're just a paranoid old couple running a legitimate, if shabby, motel?" Marcus shook his head. They're not. I know it, Daniel. I've been doing this long enough to trust my instincts, and my instincts are screaming that something's wrong with that place. Daniel studied him for a long moment. You're putting a lot of faith in a hunch. It's more than a hunch. The tips keep coming, the pattern's too consistent. And the way they acted last time I was there, the way they got defensive when I asked to look around. They're hiding something. Could be anything. Could be illegal liquor. Could be they're not paying their taxes. Could be they've got a still out back. Could be, Marcus admitted, but I don't think so. I think it's bigger than that, and I think if we don't figure it out soon, more people are going to die. Daniel sighed, setting down his coffee cup. All right, I'll do it, but I'm going to need a convincing backstory. If these people are as careful as you say, they'll want proof I'm the real deal. Over the next hour, they worked out the details. Daniel would pose as Daniel Shaw, a man wanted for armed robbery in Oklahoma. They'd create fake wanted posters, plant stories in newspapers, build a paper trail that would hold up under scrutiny. Daniel would show up at the Yellow Rose claiming he was headed for the border, needed a place to lay low for a night or two. If the Hendersons were running a criminal safe house, they'd recognize an opportunity when they saw one. What if things go south? Daniel asked. What if they figure out I'm a ranger? Marcus met his eyes. Then you get out however you can. I'll have backup nearby, but it might take time to reach you. You'll be on your own. Story of my life, Daniel said with a slight smile, but Marcus could see the concern beneath the bravado. This was dangerous. They both knew it. But it was also necessary. The plan was set in motion 2 weeks later. Daniel Shaw's wanted posters appeared in police stations across Oklahoma and northern Texas. A story ran in the Tulsa newspaper about a daring bank robbery and a manhunt for the perpetrator. It was all fabricated, but it looked real enough. Marcus made sure copies of the wanted poster made it to local law enforcement in Cochran County, knowing that gossip would spread, knowing that the Hendersons would likely hear about it. Then they waited. Daniel showed up at the Yellow Rose on a Thursday evening, driving a beat-up Ford sedan with Oklahoma plates. He'd roughed himself up a bit, wore clothes that looked lived in and dirty, carried a duffel bag that supposedly contained his ill-gotten gains. He was in character completely. The confident swagger of a man who'd just pulled off a big score and was heading for freedom. Marcus was parked 2 miles down the road in an unmarked car, waiting. He'd wanted to be closer, but they couldn't risk the Hendersons spotting him. A radio sat on the seat beside him, though he knew it wouldn't do much good out here. If Daniel needed help, he'd have to find a way to signal, and Marcus would have to get there fast. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. Marcus watched the colors shift and change, his stomach tight with anxiety. He'd sent men into dangerous situations before, but this felt different. Maybe because he knew the Hendersons now had looked into Mildred Henderson's dead eyes and felt the wrongness radiating from her like heat from asphalt. Maybe because the whole thing was built on his instinct, his hunch, and if he was wrong, he was risking Daniel's life for nothing. But he wasn't wrong. He couldn't be. Inside the Yellow Rose Motel, Daniel was getting his first real look at the place Marcus had described. The office was small and cramped, with yellowed wallpaper peeling in the corners, and a smell of old coffee and something else, something chemical he couldn't quite identify. Gerald Henderson sat behind a wooden desk, looking even older and more decrepit than the photos Marcus had shown him, and Mildred Henderson stood near the window, that famous stare fixed on Daniel like a laser. "Need a room," Daniel said, keeping his voice gruff and impatient. "Just for tonight." Gerald nodded slowly. 50 cents. Daniel pulled out a wad of bills, making sure Gerald could see it was all cash, all 20s and 50s. "I got money. That ain't a problem." He saw Gerald's eyes widen slightly at the sight of the cash. "Good. Take the bait." "Where you headed?" Gerald asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "South," Daniel said. "Got business in Mexico." "What kind of business?" "The kind that ain't nobody else's business," Daniel said, meeting the old man's gaze. He needed to be confident but not aggressive, careful but not paranoid. It was a delicate balance. Gerald studied him for a long moment, then glanced at his wife. Some unspoken communication passed between them. Mildred gave the smallest nod, barely perceptible, and Gerald turned back to Daniel. 50 cents gets you a room, Gerald said. But if you're in trouble, if you need special accommodations, that costs more. There it was, the opening Marcus had predicted. Daniel felt his heart rate increase, but kept his expression neutral. What kind of special accommodations? The kind that helps a man get where he's going without attracting attention. The kind that makes problems disappear. How much more? Gerald leaned back in his chair. Depends on how much trouble you're in. But for a man with a fat wallet heading to Mexico, I'd say $1,500. $1,500. Daniel kept his face blank, but inside he was reeling. That was a fortune, more than most people saw in a year, way more than 50 cents. Marcus had been right. The Hendersons were running something big here. That's a lot of money, Daniel said carefully. That's the price of freedom, Gerald replied. Take it or leave it. But if you leave, you're on your own. Border Patrol's been active lately. Lots of folks getting picked up trying to cross. Shame to make it this far and get caught at the finish line. Daniel pretended to consider letting the silence stretch. He needed them to think he was desperate enough to pay, but smart enough to ask questions. How do I know you can deliver? How do I know this ain't just you taking my money? You don't, Mildred Henderson spoke for the first time. Her voice like dry leaves scraping across pavement. But we've been doing this a long time. Never had a complaint. Never had a guest get caught. You pay us, you disappear. Simple as that. Show me how it works, Daniel said. Show me the route, the plan. Then maybe we talk money. Gerald and Mildred exchanged another look. Daniel could feel the tension in the room, the weight of their decision. He'd pushed, maybe too hard, but he needed evidence, needed something concrete to take back to Marcus. A conversation about hypothetical help wouldn't hold up in court. You seem awful curious for a man on the run, Gerald said slowly. I'm careful, Daniel shot back. That's how I've stayed free this long. I don't hand over $1,500 without knowing what I'm getting. Another pause. Then Gerald stood, his old bones creaking. All right, we can show you. But first, I need to see some proof you're who you say you are. Can't be too careful these days. Lots of law dogs trying to catch us doing something wrong. Daniel felt ice water run down his spine. They were suspicious. He pulled out the fake wanted poster he'd been carrying, the one that showed his face above the name Daniel Shaw, and a list of crimes. It looked real because Marcus had made sure it was printed on the same presses as real wanted posters, using the same type and layout. Gerald took the poster, studied it carefully, held it up to the light. Mildred moved closer, her dark eyes scanning every detail. Daniel forced himself to breathe normally, to look impatient rather than nervous. This was the moment. If the forgery didn't hold up, if they saw through it, he'd have to run. And running from this place out in the middle of nowhere with night falling didn't seem like a good option. Oklahoma, Gerald said finally. Long way from home. That's the point, Daniel said. Gerald handed the poster back, and Daniel saw the decision in his eyes. They believed him, or at least they believed him enough. Come on, Gerald said. We'll show you. They led him out of the office, around the back of the motel. The sun had fully set now, and the desert was dark, except for the stars overhead and the weak glow from the motel's lights. Daniel followed the elderly couple, every sense on alert. This was when things could go wrong. This was when undercover operations fell apart. He had no backup, no weapon he could easily reach, no way to call for help if the Hendersons turned on him. Behind the motel, barely visible in the darkness, was a small shed. Gerald pulled out a key ring, found the right key, and unlocked the padlock. The door swung open with a rusty creak, revealing what looked like a storage space filled with old furniture and supplies. "Help me move this," Gerald said, gesturing to a large wooden cabinet. Daniel stepped inside, and together they pushed the cabinet to the side. Beneath it was a trapdoor, metal and heavy, with another lock. Gerald knelt with difficulty, his old knees popping, and unlocked it. He heaved the trapdoor open, revealing a set of concrete steps leading down into darkness. "What is this?" Daniel asked. "Insurance," Mildred said from behind him. "For our guests and for us." Gerald pulled a flashlight from his pocket and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness below. "Come on, I'll show you where you'd wait until we arrange your transport." Every instinct Daniel had was screaming at him not to go down those stairs. Going underground, into a confined space with two people he didn't trust, was about the stupidest thing he could do. But he needed evidence. He needed to see what was down there. He needed to make this count. He started down the stairs, following Gerald's bobbing flashlight. The steps were steep and narrow, the walls close on either side. He could hear Mildred following behind him, blocking his exit. The air grew cooler and damper as they descended, and that chemical smell from the office got stronger. It was familiar, but Daniel couldn't place it. Something medical, maybe. Something sharp and clinical. The stairs opened into a larger space, and Gerald swept the flashlight around, revealing a bunker of sorts. Concrete walls, a low ceiling, a few pieces of furniture, including a cot and a table. It looked like a bomb shelter or a root cellar, the kind of thing people built during the war. But there was something wrong about it, something that made Daniel's skin crawl. "This is where you'd stay," Gerald explained. "Underground, hidden. No one knows about this except our special guests. You stay down here a day, maybe two, while we make arrangements with our contacts across the border. Then we smuggle you out, get you to Mexico safe and sound." "Comfortable," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice light despite the growing sense of dread. "Real homey." "It ain't the Ritz," Gerald agreed, "but it's safe. That's what matters." Daniel moved further into the bunker, trying to see more details. The flashlight beam was weak, shadows dancing on the walls. He could make out shelves along one wall, filled with jars and bottles, supplies for long stays, probably. Food, water, medical supplies for people on the run. That's when he saw it. Just a glimpse, just a flash of something that didn't belong. On one of the shelves, partially hidden behind other items, was a jar filled with clear liquid. And floating in that liquid was something that looked distinctly like a human finger. Daniel's blood went cold. He took a step closer, trying to see if his eyes were playing tricks on him in the dim light. But no, it was definitely a finger, pale and preserved, the nail still visible. And next to it was another jar, and another. His mind raced, trying to understand what he was seeing, trying to make sense of it. "What the hell?" he whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He felt rather than saw the change in the room. The atmosphere shifted, became dangerous. Gerald's flashlight beam stopped moving. Mildred's breathing, which had been nearly silent, became audible. "You weren't supposed to see that," Gerald said, and his voice was different now. Harder, colder. Daniel spun around, reaching for the gun he'd tucked into his waistband. But he was too slow, and the space was too confined. Something hard and heavy crashed into the back of his skull, and the world exploded in stars and pain. He fell, his knees hitting the concrete floor with a crack that sent more pain shooting through his legs. He tried to stay conscious, tried to fight, but another blow came and then another, and the darkness rushed up to swallow him. The last thing he heard before everything went black was Mildred Henderson's dry voice saying, "Get the chains. We've got a new one." Marcus checked his watch for the 100th time. It was past midnight, and Daniel should have checked in hours ago. The plan was simple. Daniel would spend the night at the motel, gather what evidence he could, and leave in the morning. He'd drive past Marcus's position and signal with his headlights. 3 quick flashes meant he'd found something. 2 meant the place was clean. 1 meant trouble. But no car had passed, no signal had come. And Marcus's gut, that same instinct that had led him to suspect the Hendersons in the first place, was screaming that something was wrong. He'd tried to be patient. Undercover work didn't always go according to schedule. Maybe Daniel had to stay longer to maintain his cover. Maybe the Hendersons were being extra cautious. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation for the silence. But Marcus didn't believe in coincidences, and he didn't believe in perfect explanations. He believed in the sick feeling in his stomach, the one that told him Daniel was in trouble. The problem was he couldn't just storm in. If he was wrong, if Daniel was fine and Marcus blew his cover, the whole operation would be for nothing. The Hendersons would clam up, any evidence would disappear, and they'd never get another chance. But if he was right, if Daniel was in danger, every second counted. Marcus started the car and drove slowly toward the Yellow Rose, keeping his headlights off. The moon was bright enough to see the road, and he didn't want to advertise his approach. As he got closer, he could see the motel's neon sign, still buzzing, still flickering. Daniel's Ford was parked in front of one of the rooms, right where it should be. But there were no lights on in the room, no movement, no sign of life. Marcus parked a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, moving quietly through the desert scrub. He changed into dark clothes before leaving his position, and now he was grateful for the camouflage. The night was cool, almost cold, the temperature dropping fast the way it did in the desert. He could hear coyotes howling in the distance, their voices eerie and mournful. As he got closer to the motel, Marcus pulled his service revolver from its holster. He moved from shadow to shadow, using the darkness as cover. The office lights were off. The guest rooms were dark. Everything looked normal, peaceful, exactly like a small motel in the middle of the night should look. But Marcus's instincts were screaming. He reached Daniel's car and peered through the windows. The duffel bag was gone. That could mean Daniel had taken it to his room, which was normal. Or it could mean something else. Marcus moved to the room where the car was parked and tried the door. Locked. He pressed his ear against it, listening. Nothing. No breathing, no movement, no sound at all. Marcus stepped back, considering his options. He could break down the door, but they would make noise and alert the Hendersons. He could try to find another way in, but these old motels weren't built with security in mind. Or he could try the office, see if he could find a master key. The office door was unlocked, which surprised him. Either the Hendersons were trusting to a fault, or they weren't worried about intruders. Marcus slipped inside, moving slowly in the darkness. The smell hit him immediately, that same chemical odor Daniel would have noticed. Formaldehyde. Marcus recognized it now. He'd smelled it before in morgues and funeral homes. Why would a motel smell like formaldehyde? He moved behind the desk, looking for keys. Found them hanging on a board, each tagged with a room number. He took the master key, but before he could leave, something caught his eye. The guest ledger lying open on the desk. Marcus clicked on his flashlight, keeping the beam low, and looked at the entries. Daniel Shaw, Room 7, checked in at 7:15 p.m., paid cash. But there was another entry below it, added in different handwriting. Same name, but next to it was written a single word that made Marcus's blood run cold. Special. He heard the creak of floorboards behind him a second too late. Something pressed against his back, cold and unmistakably the barrel of a shotgun. "Drop the gun, Ranger Coleman," Gerald Henderson's raspy voice said. "Real slow now. Don't make me paint this office with your brains." Marcus froze. His mind raced through options, scenarios, ways out. But with a shotgun pressed against his spine, his choices were limited. He slowly lowered his revolver to the desk. "Hands where I can see them," Gerald ordered. Marcus raised his hands. He could feel the old man behind him, could imagine that weathered face twisted into something ugly and cruel. "Where's Daniel?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice calm. The cowboy asking questions. "He's downstairs, having a rest." "If you hurt him." "You'll what?" Gerald laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You're in no position to make threats, Ranger. Should have stayed away. Should have minded your own business. But you just couldn't let it go, could you?" "People know I'm here," Marcus said. It was a lie, but maybe Gerald would believe it. "If I don't check in, they'll send the whole Ranger Division down here." "I don't think so," Gerald said. "I think you came alone, just like your friend. I think you were trying to be clever, trying to catch us in the act. Well, congratulations. You caught us. But now what? Marcus felt the shotgun barrel move slightly, and he knew Gerald was getting ready to shoot. This was it. This was how it ended. In a dingy motel office in the middle of nowhere, killed by an old man he'd underestimated. He thought of Jimmy, waiting back at the ranger station, not knowing what had happened. He thought of his wife, who'd begged him to take a desk job, to stop taking risks. He thought of Daniel somewhere in this building, possibly already dead. And then he heard a voice from the doorway, sharp and commanding. "Drop it, old man, or I'll drop you." Jimmy. Somehow, impossibly, Jimmy was there, his own gun trained on Gerald Henderson. Marcus didn't waste time wondering how or why. He grabbed his revolver from the desk and spun around, covering Gerald while Jimmy moved into the room. Gerald's face was a mask of rage and calculation. For a moment, Marcus thought he'd try to shoot anyway, take at least one of them with him. But then the old man lowered the shotgun, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Where is he?" Marcus demanded. "Where's Daniel?" Gerald said nothing, just stared with those watery eyes. "The bunker." Mildred Henderson's voice came from somewhere in the darkness outside. "He's in the bunker out back. But you're too late, Ranger. Much too late." Marcus felt his heart stop. He looked at Jimmy. "Watch him. If he moves, shoot him." Jimmy nodded, his face pale but determined. Marcus ran from the office around the back of the motel, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He found the shed, found the trap door already open, the metal door hanging back like a mouth waiting to swallow him. He didn't hesitate, didn't stop to think about the danger. Daniel was down there and Marcus was getting him out. The stairs were steep and treacherous, and Marcus nearly lost his footing twice on the way down. The chemical smell was overwhelming now, burning his nostrils and throat. Formaldehyde. Definitely formaldehyde. The beam of his flashlight bounced wildly as he descended, casting crazy shadows on the concrete walls. He reached the bottom and swept the light around the bunker. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Daniel was chained to the far wall, his wrists and ankles bound with heavy iron shackles. His shirt was torn and soaked with blood, his face a mass of bruises and cuts. But he was breathing. Marcus could see his chest rising and falling, shallow but steady. "Daniel!" Marcus rushed forward, nearly tripping over something on the floor. He looked down and saw a metal table, the kind used in operating rooms. And on that table were instruments, medical instruments, scalpels, bone saws, needles, jars of chemicals. His stomach turned as the implications hit him. "Marcus," Daniel's voice was weak, slurred. "That you? I'm here. I've got you." Marcus holstered his gun and examined the shackles. They were old but solid, locked with heavy padlocks. "Where are the keys?" "Don't know. They were going to—" Daniel's eyes rolled back and he slumped forward, held up only by the chains. Marcus shook him gently. "Stay with me, Daniel. Stay awake." He looked around desperately for something to break the locks, but the bunker was designed to hold people, not let them escape. Then he remembered the shotgun. Gerald's shotgun that Jimmy now had upstairs. But there was no time to run back up. Daniel was in bad shape, losing blood, possibly dying. Marcus made a decision. He aimed his revolver at the first padlock, angled it so the ricochet wouldn't hit Daniel, and fired. The sound was deafening in the confined space, his ears ringing from the blast. The lock held. He fired again. The third shot finally shattered it, the pieces falling to the floor. He moved to the second lock, repeated the process. His ears were bleeding now from the pressure, the sound, but he didn't care. 3 more shots and Daniel's hands were free. 2 more for his feet. Marcus caught him as he collapsed, lowering him to the ground as gently as he could. "Can you walk?" Daniel shook his head. "Don't think so. Marcus, you need to see." "See what?" Daniel pointed with a shaking hand toward the shelves Marcus had noticed earlier. "The jars. Look at the jars." Marcus didn't want to look. Every instinct told him to just get Daniel out of here, get away from this nightmare place. But he had to know. He had to understand what the Hendersons had been doing. He walked over to the shelves and shined his light on them. What he saw made him physically ill. Jar after jar, dozens of them, filled with formaldehyde and body parts, fingers, toes, ears, even what looked like eyes. Each jar was labeled with a date and initials. Some of the dates went back years, some were recent. Very recent. "Oh God," Marcus whispered. How many people, how many victims? How many fugitives had come to the Yellow Rose looking for help, only to end up preserved in jars like specimens in a laboratory? "There's more," Daniel managed to say. "Behind the wall. Panel. Opens." Marcus found the panel Daniel indicated, a section of the wall that looked slightly different from the rest. He pushed on it, and it swung inward, revealing a hidden room beyond. He stepped through, his flashlight illuminating what he instantly recognized as some kind of grotesque gallery. Bodies, posed bodies, preserved and positioned like mannequins in a department store. A man in a suit sitting at a table, his dead eyes staring ahead. A woman in a dress standing near a bookshelf, a book in her stiffened hands. A child, no more than 10, sitting cross-legged on the floor with toys scattered around him. All of them dead. All of them embalmed. All of them arranged in this underground chamber like some sick diorama of normal life. Marcus counted 12 bodies. 12 people who'd come to the Yellow Rose and never left. 12 lives ended and preserved by 2 elderly monsters who'd been operating right under everyone's noses for who knew how long. He stumbled back into the main bunker, fighting the urge to vomit. He had to get Daniel out, had to get help, had to burn this place to the ground and salt the earth where it stood. He got his arms under Daniel's shoulders and started dragging him toward the stairs. Daniel was a big man, and it was slow going, but Marcus was fueled by rage and horror and determination. He got him to the stairs and began the agonizing process of hauling him up, one step at a time. "Why?" Daniel mumbled as they climbed. "Why would they do this?" Marcus didn't have an answer. He couldn't fathom what would drive 2 people to do such things. Money, maybe. The $1,500 they charged desperate fugitives added up over time. But the preservation, the posing, the creation of that horrific underground gallery, that wasn't about money. That was something else, something darker. They reached the top of the stairs and Marcus pulled Daniel out into the cool night air. The stars overhead seemed impossibly bright after the darkness of the bunker. Marcus gulped in clean air, trying to clear the chemical stench from his lungs. "Jimmy," he shouted, "I need help." Jimmy appeared moments later, his face going white when he saw Daniel's condition. "Jesus, is he... He's alive. Help me get him to the car." Together they carried Daniel to Marcus's vehicle and laid him in the back seat. Jimmy ran to get the first aid kit while Marcus tried to stop the worst of the bleeding. Daniel's eyes fluttered open, focused on Marcus. "Did you see?" he whispered. "I saw." The couple, they said they did it out of remorse, felt bad about taking people's money and killing them, so they preserved them, kept them, like they were making up for it by not letting them rot. Marcus felt bile rise in his throat. That was their justification. That was how they rationalized what they'd done. Not killing people in the first place apparently wasn't an option, but making sure their bodies didn't decompose. That was their version of mercy. "Don't talk," Marcus said. "Save your strength. We're getting you to a hospital." "The Hendersons?" Daniel asked. "In custody," Jimmy said, returning with the first aid kit. "I got them both handcuffed in the office, called for backup before I came looking for you. Should be here soon." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He worked on bandaging Daniel's wounds, his hands steady despite the trembling in his chest. He'd been a Texas Ranger for 15 years. He'd seen death, violence, depravity, but nothing like this. Nothing that even came close to the horror of the Yellow Rose Motel. In the distance, he could hear sirens. Help was coming. The Hendersons would be arrested, the bunker would be excavated, the bodies would be identified and returned to their families. Justice would be served in whatever form that took. But Marcus knew that some things couldn't be made right. Some horrors couldn't be undone. The families of those 12 victims would never get their loved ones back. The people who'd stayed at the Yellow Rose over the years, who'd been served coffee by Gerald Henderson and watched by Mildred Henderson's dead eyes, would live with the knowledge that they'd been close to monsters and never known it. And Marcus himself would carry the image of that underground gallery for the rest of his life. The bodies posed in their grotesque tableau, the jars lined up on shelves like trophies, the table with its instruments of torture and death. "Why did you come?" Marcus asked Jimmy as they worked on Daniel. "I told you to stay at the station." Jimmy didn't look up from the bandage he was wrapping. "I know what you told me, but I also know you, Marcus. I know when you get that look in your eyes, that feeling that something's wrong, and I figured you might need backup, whether you wanted to admit it or not. You saved my life." "Yeah, well, that's what partners do." The sirens got louder, red and blue lights appearing on the horizon. Marcus sat back, his hands covered in Daniel's blood, and looked at the Yellow Rose Motel. The neon sign was still buzzing, still flickering, that cheerful yellow color now seeming like a mockery. A beacon that had drawn in tired travelers and desperate fugitives alike, promising rest and safety, delivering only death. How long had it been going on? How many people had the Hendersons killed before they started preserving their victims? How many bodies were buried out in the desert, unmarked and forgotten? The investigation would take months, maybe years. They'd have to go through missing persons reports, match them against the bodies in the bunker, try to piece together a timeline of murders that might stretch back decades. The first police cars arrived, officers spilling out with guns drawn. Marcus identified himself, quickly explained the situation. An ambulance pulled up moments later, and paramedics rushed to Daniel's side. Marcus stepped back, letting them work, watching as they loaded his friend onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. "He going to make it?" Marcus asked one of the paramedics. "Hard to say," the man replied. "He's lost a lot of blood, has some serious internal injuries, but he's a fighter. We'll do everything we can." Marcus watched the ambulance pull away, its siren wailing into the night. Then he turned to face the growing crowd of law enforcement. The local sheriff had arrived along with more rangers from the Austin office. Marcus gave his statement, told them about the bunker, about what he'd found. He saw the disbelief in their eyes turn to horror as they descended the stairs and saw the evidence for themselves. Gerald and Mildred Henderson were loaded into separate police cars, their faces showing no emotion. Mildred still had that dead-eyed stare, even with her wrists cuffed behind her back. Gerald looked like he'd aged another decade in the past hour, his shoulders hunched, his face slack. But neither of them spoke. Neither offered explanations or apologies. They just sat in silence as they were driven away to await trial for crimes that would shock the nation once the story broke. Marcus spent the rest of the night at the Yellow Rose, watching as investigators documented the scene, photographed the evidence, began the painstaking process of cataloging the horrors. When the sun finally rose, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold, Marcus felt like he'd aged a lifetime. He drove back to the ranger station as the morning light spread across the plains, his mind numb, his body exhausted. He wrote his report in clinical, detached language that didn't begin to capture the reality of what he'd experienced. He made phone calls to his superiors, to the district attorney, to the families of the victims they'd already identified. And then he went home to his wife, who took one look at his face and pulled him into her arms without saying a word. He held her and cried for the first time in years, cried for Daniel and the victims and the sheer senselessness of it all. The Yellow Rose Motel made national headlines. The trial of Gerald and Mildred Henderson became a media circus, with reporters from across the country descending on the tiny courthouse in Cochran County. The prosecution presented their case with painstaking detail. The bodies in the bunker, the financial records showing payments from desperate fugitives, the testimony of survivors who'd narrowly escaped. The defense tried to paint the Hendersons as mentally ill, driven to madness by years of isolation and poverty. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about shared psychotic disorders and folie à deux, two people feeding off each other's delusions until neither could distinguish right from wrong. They claimed the Hendersons genuinely believed they were helping their victims by preserving them, that in their twisted logic they were providing a kind of immortality. The jury didn't buy it. Gerald Henderson was sentenced to death. Mildred Henderson, due to her age and frail health, received life in prison without possibility of parole. Neither showed any emotion when the verdicts were read. Daniel Crawford survived, though the recovery was long and painful. He spent 3 months in the hospital, undergoing multiple surgeries to repair the damage the Hendersons had inflicted. The physical scars would fade with time, but the psychological ones ran deeper. He left the Texas Rangers a year later, unable to continue the undercover work that had nearly cost him his life. Marcus stayed on, but something had changed in him. The case haunted him in ways he couldn't articulate. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, seeing Mildred Henderson's dead eyes staring at him from the darkness. He'd drive past motels and feel his heart rate spike, his palms start to sweat. He started drinking more, sleeping less, pushing his wife away even as she tried to help. The Yellow Rose Motel was demolished 6 months after the trial. The bunker was filled with concrete, sealed away like a tomb. The land was sold to a rancher who let it sit empty, unable to find anyone willing to work or live on property with such a dark history. The neon sign was taken down, the yellow paint scraped away, but the memory remained. Local people still talked about it in whispers, still felt a chill when they drove past the empty lot where the motel once stood. Marcus retired from the Texas Rangers 5 years later, at the age of 52. His granddaughter, a bright-eyed girl named Sarah, loved to hear his stories about being a ranger, about chasing bank robbers and solving crimes. He told her sanitized versions, leaving out the darkness, focusing on the heroism and adventure. But sometimes, when she asked about his most memorable case, he'd get a distant look in his eyes, and she'd know not to press further. Years passed. The Great Depression ended, though its scars remained. World War II came and went. The world moved on, as it always does, leaving the horrors of the Yellow Rose Motel to fade into history, a dark footnote in the story of the American Southwest. But Marcus never forgot. On quiet nights when the wind blew across the Texas plains and the coyotes howled in the distance, he'd remember. He'd remember the smell of formaldehyde, the weight of Daniel's body as he dragged him up those stairs, the sight of those preserved corpses arranged in their horrible tableau. He'd remember Gerald Henderson's raspy voice saying, "That's the price of freedom," and Mildred Henderson's dead eyes watching him from the doorway. He'd remember and he'd understand that some evils don't have explanations. Some people are simply broken in ways that can't be fixed, driven by impulses that normal minds can't comprehend. And sometimes the only thing you can do is stop them, bring them to justice, and try to live with the memories of what you've seen. The story of the Yellow Rose became legend in law enforcement circles, a cautionary tale about trusting your instincts, about the dangers that can hide behind ordinary facades. New recruits at the Texas Ranger Academy heard about it in their training, learning from Marcus's investigation, from the mistakes that nearly cost Daniel his life, from the persistence that finally brought the Hendersons to justice. And somewhere in a maximum security prison, Mildred Henderson sat in her cell, her dark eyes as dead and unreadable as ever, taking her secrets to the grave when she finally died at the age of 93. She never spoke about the crimes, never explained why. She just watched the world with those empty eyes until they closed for the last time. Gerald Henderson never made it to his execution. He died of a heart attack in his cell 3 years after sentencing,